Welcome to PIHU classes. Today we will learn gastric motility and secretions.
When we eat food, it's first chewed up in the mouth and mixes with saliva to form a mushy mass called a bolus. And then it travels down a muscular tube called the esophagus. Next, it enters the stomach through the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a ring of muscles surrounding an opening. The stomach has three main parts: the fundus, the body, and the antrum. The body is further divided into a proximal portion and a distal portion. The fundus and proximal body make up the orad region, or top half of the stomach. The distal body and the antrum make up the caudad region, or bottom half of the stomach. Once the food bolus is partially digested in the stomach, it's called chyme, and it passes through the pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The pancreas is connected to the duodenum through the pancreatic duct, and it secretes many digestive enzymes to further break down food. All these parts play a role in gastric motility, which is the contraction of the stomach to break up food and move it into the intestine. Like other parts of the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach has 4 layers. Starting from the innermost layer to the outermost layer, these layers are the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. The mucosa and muscularis externa layers are modified in the stomach. The mucosa contains various glands filled with different cells that secrete the components of gastric juice. In the body of the stomach, there are parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid, or HCl, which is a strong acid that helps to break down protein, and chief cells that secrete pepsinogen, an inactive enzyme. When pepsinogen is exposed to hydrochloric acid, it activates to become pepsin, an enzyme that helps break down proteins. In the antrum, there are mucus cells which secrete mucus, which protects the stomach lining from the acidic environment. There are also G cells, which secrete a hormone called gastrin. Unlike the other secretions, gastrin is not secreted into the stomach lumen, but instead it's released into the bloodstream, where it can reach the basolateral surface of other stomach cells, which is the cell surface that faces the blood. Gastrin increases the hydrochloric acid secretion of the parietal cells. It increases pepsinogen secretion by the chief cells, and it also increases the contraction of the stomach muscles. The next layer is the submucosa, and is mainly made up of connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves, which supply the mucosa. The nerves in the submucosa branch out and connect with one another, forming the submucosal plexus of nerves which actually stretch throughout the gastrointestinal tract. In the stomach, the submucosal plexus regulates gastric secretions of various glands and controls blood flow to the stomach. Next, there's the muscularis externa layer of the stomach, which contains 3 layers of smooth muscle that involuntarily contract in waves called peristalsis. These waves of peristalsis help the stomach mix, digest, and empty the food that it's received. The 3 muscular layers include an outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and inner oblique layer, which is unique to the stomach. This extra layer of inner oblique muscles provide more forceful contraction in the stomach. In addition, the thickness of the muscular layers increases as you go from the orad region to the caudad region, and that helps push food toward and past the pyloric sphincter. Innervation of these muscles is from the myenteric plexus, which lies between the circular and longitudinal muscle layers. Both the myenteric and submucosal plexuses make up the enteric nervous system, which can function autonomically without input from the central nervous system, and is often called the second brain because of how many interconnected nerves there are. In fact, the myenteric and submucosal plexuses contain just as many neurons as the spinal cord. In addition, they're connected to the central nervous system. They receive parasympathetic input through the vagus nerve, which increases gastric secretion and motility, and sympathetic input through nerve fibers from the celiac ganglion, which inhibits those functions. Finally, the outermost layer is the serosa, which is a thin, slippery membrane that surrounds the entire gastrointestinal tract, kind of like the casing around a sausage. When food travels down the esophagus toward the stomach, it's propelled downwards by peristalsis, gravity, and the lower pressure in the abdominal cavity. When food reaches the distal part of the esophagus, it triggers a process called receptive relaxation. That's where food distends the esophagus, and that's detected by mechanoreceptors in the muscularis externa layer of the distal esophagus. Next, the mechanoreceptors relay that information up to the brain via the vagus nerve. Once the brain processes that information, a motor signal is sent back down the vagus nerve to the myenteric plexus. The nerves in the myenteric plexus secrete a neurotransmitter called vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP, which cause the smooth muscles in the esophagus and the orad region of the stomach to relax. This relaxation lets the food through, and it's received by the stomach, hence the term receptive relaxation. Once food has entered the stomach, it distends the stomach, and this is sensed by receptors in the submucosa called mechanoreceptors, which triggers the release of gastrin from the G cells in the stomach. Gastrin promotes the secretion of hydrochloric acid from parietal cells and pepsinogen from chief cells, as well as increased contraction of the stomach muscles. Similar to the esophagus, the stomach has waves of peristalsis that start near the lower esophageal sphincter and move toward the pyloric sphincter. This motion is initially just a gentle ripple, but it becomes more powerful due to the thick muscular walls of the caudad region of the stomach. The enteric nervous system regulates the rate that the stomach contracts, and it's typically about 4 contractions per minute. When food reaches the stomach, the rate remains the same, but the force of the contraction increases. These contractions break apart food into particles that are about 1 millimeter in size so that they can pass through the pyloric sphincter. Any larger particles get pushed back into the body of the stomach, a process called repulsion, so that they can be further broken down. Once the food has been broken down, it moves into the duodenum. Gastric emptying usually happens in a few hours, and it varies a bit depending on the stomach contents. Liquids empty faster than solids, and lipids that contain lots of calories, like juices, empty slower than liquids like water. Another factor is the amount of food eaten and the volume of content in the stomach. Eating a single chip with salsa won't distend the stomach very much, so the stimulus for gastric motility is relatively small, meaning that the chip might hang out in the stomach for a while. On the flip side, eating 3 burritos will distend the stomach quite a bit, and that'll also slow down gastric emptying since there's a lot to break down. Like most things, the most efficient gastric emptying takes place somewhere in between. Foods high in fat also slow down gastric emptying, and that's because fat stimulates release of the hormone cholecystokinin, or CCK, from eye cells of the mucosa of the duodenum. CCK binds to its receptors on the stomach to slow down the rate of gastric emptying by decreasing stomach contractions so that there's enough time for fat to be digested and absorbed in the small intestine. Acidic substances containing lots of protons also slow down gastric emptying. And that's because hydrogen ion receptors in the duodenal mucosa detect the high concentration of protons in the chyme, and send that information to gastric smooth muscle cells through interneurons in the myenteric plexus. This slows down the delivery of gastric contents to the duodenum, and ensures enough time for neutralization of the protons by pancreatic bicarbonate. This neutralization of duodenal contents is necessary for pancreatic enzymes to work in the duodenum. Alright, as a quick recap, gastric motility is made up of 3 main events. Receptive relaxation, where the orad and esophageal sphincter relax to let food into the stomach. Mixing and digestion, where food is broken down by gastric acid, enzymes, and the contraction of the stomach. And gastric emptying, where food leaves the stomach and goes into the duodenum.
Thank you.